The first time I realized my family had already written me out of my own life was not at the reading of a will or in a lawyer's office, but at a Thanksgiving dinner table where my name was spoken like an inconvenience. I was standing at the kitchen sink, drying my hands on a faded linen towel when I heard my daughter-in-law say it. "She won't need to know yet," Claire whispered, her voice sharp but controlled. "Just wait until after Christmas." There was a pause. Then my son Daniel sighed. "Mom won't fight it," he said. "She never does." The room went quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. My chest tightened in a way I had not felt since the day my husband was buried. I did not walk into the dining room. I did not drop a plate or clear my throat. I stayed exactly where I was, staring at my reflection in the microwave door, at the woman with silver hair pulled back too tightly with lines carved by decades of compromise. That woman was me, and apparently she was already excluded. For 40 years, I had built my life around other people's needs. I had raised my son alone after his father died in a construction accident 2 weeks before Christmas. I had worked my way up from an assistant accountant to the financial director of a regional manufacturing company, often sleeping 4 hours a night, often choosing stability over joy. I told myself it was worth it. Family always is. That Thanksgiving, I paid for everything: the turkey, the wine, the rented table, because Claire insisted my dining room looked dated. I smiled when her parents arrived late and criticized the gravy. I laughed when Daniel avoided my eyes. And then dessert came. Claire stood, tapping her spoon against her glass with a practiced smile. "We have an announcement." Daniel reached for her hand. My heart lifted despite everything. For one brief, foolish moment, I thought they might say thank you. Instead, Claire said, "We've decided to restructure the family trust." The words landed like a quiet slap. She went on talking about efficiency, about modernizing assets, about how things needed to move forward. Daniel nodded beside her, looking relieved, as if something heavy had already been resolved. I waited for my name. It never came. When her father asked casually, "And Margaret's role?" Claire tilted her head. "Oh, Margaret's comfortable," she said. "She doesn't really need to be involved anymore." Comfortable. I tasted blood where I had bitten the inside of my cheek. That night, after everyone left, I washed dishes alone. Daniel did not offer to help. He kissed my cheek like a stranger and said he was tired. I went to bed in the guest room of my own house, listening to the familiar creaks of the floorboards. And something inside me hardened. I knew then that this was not an accident. This was planning. This was favoritism. This was betrayal wrapped in politeness. But what they did not know was this: the trust they were restructuring was not the only one that existed. And the woman they believed would quietly step aside had already learned how to survive far worse than exclusion. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, and made my first decision. I would not confront them. I would not cry. I would watch. And I would remember everything. Because revenge does not begin with anger. It begins with clarity. And as the sun rose that morning, I realized something else. They had underestimated me. That would be their final mistake. The mistake most people make when they decide to push an older woman aside is assuming she has stopped paying attention. I had not. I simply learned to listen without reacting. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas were filled with careful performances. Claire brought over brochures for retirement communities I never asked about. Daniel suddenly insisted on managing my mail, claiming he was worried about scams. They spoke to me slowly, kindly, as if I were already fading. I let them. Inside, I was cataloging everything. Every sideways glance, every document Daniel slid across the table for me to sign without explanation. Every time Claire referred to my house as too much space for one person. At night, I pulled old files from the locked cabinet in my study, the cabinet Daniel believed held only tax records. My hands moved automatically, muscle memory from decades in finance. There were accounts my husband and I had opened quietly after his brother tried to take advantage of us during a family dispute. There were contingency clauses, beneficiary amendments, and one irrevocable trust Claire had never known existed. The trust was mine alone. It held controlling shares of the company. Daniel now worked for the same company Claire bragged about to her friends, the same company she assumed would one day fund her lifestyle. I had transferred those shares years ago when Daniel married Claire and stopped asking questions. Back then, it had been an act of protection. Now it was leverage. Christmas Eve arrived, wrapped in artificial cheer. Claire hosted this year, insisting it would be easier for me. Her house was a mansion built on debt and assumptions decorated in white and gold, every surface polished to impress. At dinner, she handed out envelopes. Daniel opened his first. His face lit up. "It's made up," Mom, he said, startled. You didn't tell me. Claire smiled tightly. It's a preliminary draft, she said. Just something for the future. I did not need to open mine to know what it contained. Still, I did. The will was brief, efficient, painfully impersonal. Daniel inherited the house. Claire was named executor. I received a stipend and a clause recommending assisted living if deemed necessary. My hands did not shake. I folded the paper carefully and placed it beside my plate. Claire watched me like a hawk. Well, she asked. I smiled. If that's what you both think is best, I said softly. Relief flooded Daniel's face. Claire relaxed just slightly. That was the moment I knew they believed they had won. Later that night, as snow fell quietly outside, Claire cornered me near the fireplace. I hope you don't feel hurt, she said. This is just practical. I met her eyes, of course. Her smile sharpened. You've always been adaptable. I went home alone, carrying my coat over my arm, feeling lighter than I had in years. Because the truth was this. The document they had shown me meant nothing. The real will was already filed, already sealed, already protected by a lawyer who owed me more loyalty than they could imagine. And the company they were building their future on was still very quietly under my control. I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and sent a single email. It was to my attorney. 4 words only. It is time. Outside, Christmas lights flickered across quiet houses. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and felt something unfamiliar bloom in my chest. Anticipation. They thought the story was ending. They had no idea it was only beginning. If you want to hear what happens next, how patience turns into power and silence into justice, stay with me. And when this story speaks to you, let me know in the comments. Like the video if you believe karma always comes due, and subscribe if you want more stories where women like us finally take back what was always ours. The first move in revenge is never dramatic. It is administrative. The Monday after Christmas, I dressed the way I always had for important meetings. Navy wool coat, pearl earrings Robert gave me on our 10th anniversary, low heels that clicked softly but firmly against marble floors, the kind of sound people subconsciously respect. I arrived at the law firm at 8:45, early enough to remind them who valued time. Thomas Keller had been my attorney for over 25 years. He had seen me sign contracts with shaking hands after my husband died. He had watched me rebuild clause by clause, asset by asset. When his assistant showed me in, he stood immediately. Margaret, he said, concern flickering in his eyes. I wondered when you'd come. I placed Claire's version of the will on his desk. They showed me this, I said. He scanned it once, then looked up sharply. You didn't sign anything? No. A slow smile appeared. Good. I exhaled for the first time that day. What they don't know, I said, is how much damage they're about to do to themselves. He leaned back, folding his hands. You still hold controlling interest through the Anderson Trust. Legally airtight. They cannot touch it without your consent. And the contingency clause, still valid, triggered by attempted coercion, misrepresentation, or exclusion. I nodded, then we proceed. Over the next 2 hours, we laid the groundwork. Audits, notices, timelines, quiet letters sent to the board of the company Daniel worked for, requesting a review of recent financial decisions. Nothing accusatory, just questions. Questions make people nervous. By the time I left, my hands were steady, my posture straight. The woman who walked out of that office was not the one drying dishes in silence weeks earlier. She was awake. That evening, Daniel called. Mom, he said cautiously, have you been talking to a lawyer? I smiled into the phone. I always talk to my lawyer. A pause. Claire's upset. She says you're making things complicated. I'm simplifying, I replied. You'll see. Silence again. Then you don't trust us. I closed my eyes. I trusted you with my life, I said softly. This is just paperwork. After we hung up, I sat alone in the dark, replaying his voice in my mind. Not angry, not cruel. Weak. That realization hurt more than betrayal. But weakness can be taught, or it can be corrected. I went to bed knowing the first domino had been tipped. Daniel just didn't hear it fall yet. The company audit began quietly, too quietly. Daniel mentioned it in passing over Sunday lunch as if it were an inconvenience rather than a threat. They're just reviewing vendor contracts, he said, pushing peas around his plate. Standard stuff. Claire shot him a warning look. Mom doesn't need to worry about business stress. I sipped my iced tea. Who initiated the audit, I asked. Daniel hesitated. The board. Which board member? Another pause, I'm not sure. Claire's jaw tightened. Why does it matter? Because I said calmly, audits never come from nowhere. That night, my phone buzzed. Thomas. They found irregularities, he said without preamble. Nothing illegal yet, but sloppy. Conflicts of interest. Preferential contracts. I smiled to myself. Claire's brother. Yes, he said. Consulting fees. Inflated invoices. I hung up and stared out the window at the dark street. Christmas decorations still glowed cheerful and unaware. The next morning, Claire arrived unannounced. She stood in my doorway, impeccably dressed, eyes sharp. We need to talk, she said. Of course, I replied, stepping aside. She didn't sit. I don't know what game you think you're playing, she said, lowering her voice. But you're hurting Daniel. I'm protecting myself, I corrected. You agreed to the will. I agreed not to argue at dinner. Her lips thinned. You're being selfish. That word again. It had followed me my entire life every time I chose survival over silence. I raised Daniel alone, I said quietly. I worked 3 jobs while he slept. I built stability from nothing. If I choose not to disappear quietly, that does not make me selfish. Her eyes flashed. He's my husband. And he is my son. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she leaned in close enough for me to smell her perfume. If you keep this up, she said, you'll lose him. I looked at her steadily. No, I said. I'll finally meet him. She left without another word. That afternoon, the board called an emergency meeting. Daniel was not invited. Claire was furious. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something shift in the air. Not victory. Momentum. Because when power starts to move, it doesn't announce itself. It simply changes hands. And the people who assumed it was theirs are always the last to realize it's gone. Daniel came to my house on a Wednesday evening without calling first. That alone told me everything. He stood on the porch, longer than necessary, his shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing for a storm. When I opened the door, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager caught lying. Mom, he said quietly, we need to talk. I stepped aside. Come in. He didn't sit. He paced, rubbing his hands together, eyes darting toward the hallway like Claire might step out at any moment. The board froze. Several contracts, he said finally. They're reviewing everything signed in the past 18 months. I nodded as if this were casual news. They asked me to step back temporarily, he continued. Just until things are clear. Did they say why I asked? He swallowed. Conflict of interest. Claire's brother. I didn't know it was that bad. There it was. The first crack. I walked to the kitchen and poured us both water. My movements were slow, deliberate. Silence does more work than accusation ever could. Daniel, I said, turning to him, did you read every document you signed? He flinched. I trusted her. I know. That answer startled him. You're not angry, he asked. I'm disappointed, I said softly. Anger passes. Disappointment lingers. He sank into a chair. They think I was complicit, he said, voice breaking. They think I let it happen. And did you? He opened his mouth, then closed it. That was answer enough. I need your help, he said finally. Claire says you started this. I met his eyes. Claire benefits from you believing that. He rubbed his face, exhaustion etched deep. She says you're trying to control everything, that you never let go. I felt the old wound ache. Daniel, I said I let go when you married her. I stepped back when you asked. What I did not do was hand my life over to someone who saw me as disposable. His jaw tightened. She wants me to cut you off, he admitted. Legally? Completely? There it was. The sentence that finally burned away the last of my hesitation. I know, I said. He stared. You know? She's already tried, I replied calmly. He stood abruptly. That's not true. Check the draft amendments in your email, I said. The ones she didn't realize I was copied on. He froze. Color drained from his face as he pulled out his phone, scrolling frantically. Oh my God, he whispered. She was going to remove you entirely. I watched my son absorb the truth in real time. The betrayal, the manipulation, the quiet, calculated erasure. I didn't sign it, he said quickly. I swear. I know, I replied. He looked at me, then really looked at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. What do I do? He asked. I placed my hand over his. You tell the truth, I said, and you let consequences land where they belong. That night, after he left, my phone buzzed. A message from Claire. You're tearing this family apart. I stared at the screen, then typed back only 3 words. You already did. Claire did not confront me directly again. That was how I knew she was afraid. Instead, she went on offense everywhere else. She called relatives, old friends, anyone who would listen. She painted me as unstable, manipulative, a bitter old woman, desperate for relevance. She hinted at cognitive decline. She even suggested delicately that I might need medical evaluation. It was sloppy. Fear makes people careless. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. This time Daniel was invited. Claire was not. She tried to come anyway. Security stopped her at the door. From the hallway, I heard her voice rise sharp and shrill, demanding explanations, invoking her husband's name like a shield. Daniel did not look back. Inside the room, the air was heavy. Files were stacked neatly in front of each board member. Evidence has weight. You can feel it before it's spoken. The chairman cleared his throat. Daniel, he said, we need clarity. Daniel stood. I failed to exercise proper oversight, he said. I trusted the wrong person. I allowed personal relationships to interfere with professional judgment. The room was silent. I take responsibility, he continued, and I will accept whatever decision the board makes. It was the first time I had ever heard him speak without deflection. The vote was swift. Daniel was removed from executive authority, temporarily retained as an employee under supervision. Claire's brother was terminated immediately and referred for investigation. And then the chairman turned to me. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, as trustee of the Anderson Trust, you retain controlling interest. The board formally requests your interim leadership. Claire's scream echoed faintly from the hallway as the words settled. Daniel looked at me, eyes wide. I didn't know, he whispered. I never hid it, I replied. You just stopped asking. I accepted the role without ceremony, not out of pride, out of necessity. When I stepped outside, Claire was waiting. Her composure was gone. Her eyes were wild. You planned this, she hissed. You waited. Yes, I said simply. You used my husband against me. No, I corrected. You used him against himself. She laughed brittle and hollow. You think this is over? I leaned in close enough for her to hear every word. This is the moment you should have stopped, I said, because now everything you've built is going to be examined. Her face went pale. As she turned away, phone already pressed to her ear, I felt no triumph, only certainty. The escalation was complete, and the collapse had begun. Power changes the temperature of a room. On my first morning back at the company as interim leader, I felt it immediately. Conversation stopped when I entered. Eyes followed me, curious, cautious, calculating. Some employees looked relieved. Others looked afraid. I understood all of them. I gathered the senior managers in the conference room I had once helped design back when Daniel was still in college, and Claire was a name I didn't yet know. I'm not here to punish, I said. I'm here to understand. That alone made a few shoulders drop. Over the next week, the truth surfaced layer by layer. Inflated invoices, backdated approvals, vendors chosen not for quality but for loyalty to Claire. A pattern of manipulation that was subtle enough to hide behind smiles, but consistent enough to be undeniable. One afternoon, my assistant, a woman named Paula, who had worked here longer than Claire, closed the door behind her. She threatened us, Paula said quietly, not directly, just implied, if we spoke up. How many, I asked? Paula hesitated. Most of us. I nodded. Fear thrives in silence. I had lived long enough to recognize it. Meanwhile, Claire did not stay quiet. She sent Daniel messages every hour. Apologies, accusations, tears, promises. When those failed, she escalated. She showed up at my house again. This time she did not ask to come in. You think you've won, she said, voice trembling with rage. But Daniel will choose me. I looked at her through the glass door. She looked smaller now, fractured. Daniel is choosing himself, I replied. That's what frightens you. You're poisoning him against me. No, I said. I stopped protecting you from the truth. She laughed sharply. You always hated me. I considered that. I didn't hate you, I said. I underestimated you. Her eyes flickered. That was the wound that mattered. That evening, Daniel came over. He looked exhausted, older. She wants marriage counseling, he said quietly. She says we can fix this. And what do you want, I asked. He stared at his hands. I don't know who she is anymore. I reached across the table and took his hand. You're allowed to grieve the person you thought she was, I said. But don't confuse grief with obligation. He nodded slowly. The next day, the auditors uncovered something I hadn't expected. A personal account in Claire's name, offshore, quietly fed from company funds over the past 2 years. Not enough to ruin the company, enough to prove intent. Thomas called me immediately. This changes things, he said. Criminal implications. I closed my eyes. So it's reached that point, I murmured. That night as I lay awake, I realized that something that made my chest ache. Revenge had stopped being the goal. Protection was, and that meant I could not control how far this would go. The final domino was about to fall, whether any of us were ready or not. Claire disappeared the morning after the offshore account was flagged. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her car was gone. The house Daniel shared with her sat dark and silent closets half empty. She did not take her jewelry. She took documents. Daniel found the note on the kitchen counter. "I need time. Don't look for me." He brought it to me with shaking hands. "She ran," he said. "She really ran." "Yes," I replied. "Because running is what people do when lies collapse." Within hours, the board authorized legal action. The auditors forwarded their findings. Thomas contacted federal investigators. What had once been a family drama was now something far colder and far more permanent. Daniel sat at my dining table, head in his hands. "This is my fault," he whispered. "No," I said firmly. "This is what happens when manipulation goes unchecked." He looked up, eyes red. "I brought her into our lives, and you are helping remove her," I replied. "That matters." Days passed, then a week, then two. The media caught wind of it. Headlines were careful at first. Executive spouse under investigation. Financial irregularities discovered. Anonymous sources. Claire's name was not yet public, but it would be. One evening, Daniel asked a question I had been expecting. "Did you plan all of this?" he asked quietly. "From the beginning." I thought carefully before answering. "I planned to protect myself," I said. "What followed came from your wife's choices." He nodded slowly. "I don't know how to live with that," he admitted. "You don't have to yet," I said. "You just have to stop lying to yourself." The call came late one night. They had found her. A hotel 2 states away. False name. Cash payments. She had tried to move money again. Failed. This time there would be no quiet settlements, no polite exits. When Daniel heard, he didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He just sat very still. "I loved her," he said. "I know," I replied. That was when I felt it. Not triumph. Not relief. The heavy final weight of consequence. As winter deepened outside, I realized the story we had been living was no longer about revenge. It was about inheritance. Not of money, but of truth. And in the next chapters, that truth would demand its price from all of us. If you think betrayal ends when lies are exposed, stay with me. The most painful part is still ahead. The day Claire's name became public, the phones did not stop ringing. Reporters, former colleagues, distant relatives who had not spoken to me in years suddenly remembered my number. Everyone wanted a statement, a reaction, a villain or a hero to pin the story on. I gave them nothing. Silence, I had learned, unnerves people far more than outrage. Daniel moved into the guest room at my house without discussion. Not because I asked, but because he had nowhere else to stand that felt solid. At night, I heard him pacing. Sometimes he slept. Sometimes he didn't. Grief is loud even when a house is quiet. One evening, as rain pressed against the windows, he finally spoke the question that had been hanging between us. "Mom," he said, staring into his untouched dinner, "if I hadn't married her, would any of this have happened?" I set my fork down. "Yes," I said gently. He looked up startled. "Not this version," I continued, "but something. Everyone faces a reckoning eventually. This just happened to be yours." He absorbed that slowly. "I feel like I failed you," he said. The words hit harder than any accusation Claire had ever thrown at me. "You failed to see me," I said honestly. That hurt. But failure isn't permanent unless you refuse to learn. He nodded, eyes wet. That same week, federal investigators requested a formal interview with me. They wanted history, context, motive. I gave them facts, not feelings. Dates, documents, patterns. One of them, a woman about my age, paused before leaving. "You're very composed," she said. "Most people in your position aren't." I smiled faintly. "When you've spent decades being underestimated, I said you learn how to wait." The company stabilized under my interim leadership. Employees who had been silent for years began to speak. Stories emerged of subtle threats of careers quietly stalled if loyalty wavered. Claire's influence had been wide and suffocating. Each revelation tightened something in Daniel's chest. "She did this behind my back," he said one night. "Right under my name." "Yes," I replied, "and that is what you will have to forgive yourself for." The word forgive made him flinch. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "You don't have to today," I said. "But you will, or this will own you longer than it ever owned her." That night, I dreamed of my late husband. He stood at the edge of a construction site, hard hat under his arm, watching Daniel from a distance. He didn't look angry, just disappointed. I woke with tears on my pillow and a clarity I hadn't expected. The next phase was coming, and it would not be about Claire. It would be about whether my son could carry what came next. Claire was formally charged in early spring. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The words looked unreal, printed on white paper, stripped of the woman I had known. Daniel read the indictment once, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. "I don't want Lily to see this someday and think it defines her," he said. That sentence told me more about his growth than any apology ever could. "Yes, Lily." The child Claire had barely mentioned in her frantic messages, the child she had treated more like a possession than a person. Daniel filed for divorce quietly. No drama, no public statements, just signatures and silence. On the day it was finalized, he asked me to walk with him through the neighborhood where he had grown up. The houses looked smaller now, or maybe we had both changed. "I was afraid," he said suddenly, "of disappointing you, of never measuring up." I stopped walking. "Daniel," I said, turning to face him, "do you know what disappointed me most?" He shook his head. "That you thought love was something you had to earn by agreeing," I said. "I never wanted obedience. I wanted honesty." His shoulders sagged, as if a weight he'd carried for years finally loosened. "I don't know who I am without her," he admitted. "That's because she made herself your mirror," I replied. "Now you get to decide what reflects back." At the company, the board asked me to remain permanently. I declined. I did not fight to reclaim power, I told them. I fought to correct its abuse. They accepted my decision with more respect than I had expected. I recommended Daniel instead. There was hesitation, discussion, then agreement. On his first day back in a leadership role, Daniel stood in front of the employees and did something Claire never had. He apologized. Not vaguely, not defensively, specifically, for not listening, for not questioning, for not protecting the people who had trusted him. When he finished, the room was silent. Then someone began to clap, slowly, steadily. That night at home, Daniel poured us both tea and sat across from me. "I don't deserve this second chance," he said. "No one ever does," I replied. "That's why it's called grace." Outside, spring had begun to soften the air. The long winter was ending. But I knew better than to believe this was the end of the story. Because the final test of revenge is not punishment. It is what you choose to build after the fire burns out. And that choice was still waiting for us both. If you've ever wondered whether healing is possible after betrayal, stay with me. The answer is closer than you think. Forgiveness did not arrive with an apology. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, in an ordinary moment, when Daniel came home early, carrying a cardboard box of files, and asked if we could sit at the kitchen table like we used to when he was a child. "I found these," he said, sliding the box toward me. Inside were old contracts, handwritten notes meeting minutes from years before Claire entered our lives. My handwriting was there. My husband's. Margins filled with decisions that had once kept food on the table and fear at bay. "I didn't know how much you carried," Daniel said. "I thought you were just strong." I traced a finger along a yellowed page. "Strength is what people call endurance when they benefit from it." He nodded, swallowing hard. The trial moved forward quietly after that. No spectacle, no grandstanding. Claire's lawyers tried to frame her actions as desperation, as pressure, as the result of being married to a man who never truly chose her. The judge listened, then ruled, guilty. When the sentence was read, I did not feel satisfaction. I felt finality. A door closing without drama, without ceremony. Daniel did not attend sentencing. He stayed home with Lily, helping her build a puzzle on the living room floor. He told me later that she laughed when he put a piece in the wrong place, and that it was the first time he'd heard her laugh like that in months. That mattered more than any verdict. Weeks passed. The company stabilized under Daniel's leadership. Slowly, carefully, he reversed decisions that had favored speed over integrity. He brought back people who had been pushed out quietly. He asked questions he once would have avoided. Sometimes late at night, he would sit across from me with a legal pad and say, "Tell me what you would have done." And sometimes I answered, and sometimes I didn't. "You don't need my shadow," I told him once. "You need your own spine." He smiled at that. A real smile. The kind that reaches the eyes. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the prison. It was from Claire. I did not open it immediately. I placed it in the drawer and went about my day. When evening came, I made tea, sat alone, and finally unfolded the paper. She wrote about regret, about loneliness, about realizing too late that control is not love. She asked for forgiveness. I read it once. Then I folded it and placed it back in the envelope. Forgiveness, I had learned, does not require a response. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. And in the quiet hours before dawn, I understood something I had not allowed myself to consider before. Revenge had never been my true aim. Release had been. Spring arrived gently, as if the world itself were tired of conflict. The trees outside my kitchen window bloomed without asking permission. Light lingered longer in the evenings. Lily ran barefoot through the grass, her laughter unburdened by adult choices she should never have had to carry. Daniel stood beside me one afternoon watching her chase bubbles across the yard. "She's safe," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "and so are you." He exhaled a long breath that seemed to empty something old from his chest. On the anniversary of my husband's death, we visited the cemetery together. Daniel placed fresh flowers at the headstone, his hand steady. "I think I finally understand what you meant by legacy," he said. "It's not what you leave behind, it's what you refuse to pass on." I squeezed his hand. At the company's annual meeting, Daniel spoke plainly. No rehearsed optimism, no inflated promises. He talked about accountability, about rebuilding trust, about remembering the human cost of every decision. The room listened. Afterward, several women approached me quietly. Some older, some younger, all with the same look in their eyes. "Thank you," one said, "for not disappearing." I went home that evening and opened the drawer where I kept the second trust, the one that had protected me when no one else could. I amended it, not out of fear, out of peace. The final pages named Daniel and Lily as beneficiaries with safeguards that could not be altered by charm or pressure. Not because I did not trust my son, but because love should never depend on memory alone. That night, Daniel found me in the study. "Are you sure?" he asked, gesturing toward the documents. "Yes," I said, "because now you understand why they exist." He nodded. "I won't forget," he said. "I know," I replied. As summer approached, life settled into something quieter, healthier. The kind of calm that comes not from avoidance, but from resolution. I began to tell my story to friends, then to strangers. Women my age who had been excluded, dismissed, rewritten by families who mistook patience for weakness. They listened, and they nodded, because they understood. If you are listening to this and you have ever been pushed aside after a lifetime of giving, hear me now. You are not invisible. You are not obsolete. And you are not required to accept injustice simply because it comes wrapped in family. Revenge does not have to be loud to be complete. Sometimes it is simply the courage to reclaim your place and live well. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about justice, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to rise again.